Oh, good morning to each of you who have come on in this November 13th. It turns out that November 13th is a particularly special day at the Trappist Monastery. For those of you who are Catholics, remember we have All Saints' Day on November 1st. Well, the Benedictines have All Benedictine Saints' Day, and it's November 13th, in which we especially have a Mass celebrating all of the Benedictine saints who have preceded us. And hopefully, each of the monks here will be part of this. There's no Paulist Saints feast day. It could be because there are no Paulist saints. I, I, I don't know. I hope to be one someday, but it's a long shot. Uh, we're going to talk about freedom and contemplation today. And as Chris started off, he spoke about books. Well, I've got a couple of ideas in books that you might want to look at or think about. And this one is called This Tender Land. And it's by a guy named Kruger, William Kent Kruger. It's a novel, much like the novel I think I talked about last time. And I'm not going to tell you the story. It's a great story, a great adventure story, but it's about young people. But it's not an adolescence book. It just happens to be young people on this journey during the Depression. And one of the things that comes up is faith. And this young boy, he's 12 years old, he has the only God he believes in is the tornado God, because that's the God that destroys everything. That's the shepherd who eats his own sheep, as he says. His life, the boy's life, is really messy. A lot of bad things have happened. And as with many of us nowadays, people don't believe in a deity, a God, an ultimate reality because of all the mess that's in their life or around them. And yet, he runs into people whose lives are kind of messy and seem to have some sort of a faith. And they act in a certain kindly, loving manner that makes no sense to him. So it's a powerful book that challenges us in our modern day and age. This Tender Land, I believe we'll be getting this soon in our bookstore. Another one, this is a brand new book, and it's by Michael Casey, who is a Cistercian out of Australia. He lives in a Trappist monastery in Australia. And this is called Synovium. That's how you say it, Synovium. And I thought, oh, this kid, when we talk about this book to people as just, it's a book for insider monks or something like that. No, it isn't. It's really a great book about prayer, especially contemplative prayer. And the whole idea of Synovium is it means the common life. But the common life has a lot of prayer to it. And so I think it's a really good book. He calls it Reflections on Monastic Community, but I think it's a book for everybody. But one of the things it does is it would answer the question, if it happens to be your question, of what the heck is Terry Ryan doing in a monastery? Why isn't he out there working in the field and taking care of people and being active and so on and so forth? Well, contemplative prayer is supposed to free you up to be open to what God might be calling you to and not be stuck in what you did or were doing, but to be open to whatever without trying to connect that to this. Although I think that my past work could probably be connected from that to this, but for a lot of people, it seems so different. But what I'm finding is I've got some freedom, or I've taken advantage, or I've decided that I'm free enough to stop something and to start something, be willing to change, in other words. Uh, in that it's me that needs to change. And for a lot of my work in the past, I was working to try and change the world around me. Well, now it's me that needs to be changed. Oh, well, it always was me that needed to be changed. And that's part of what the contemplative life is supposed to do, is change the person. And what we often do, because we're so stuck in our ways that we're not free enough to work on ourselves, because when you work on yourself, the things that you actually do, maybe where you live or the activities you participate in, the people with whom you have contact, if you work on yourself, some of those things might have to change or might just change as you work on yourself. Uh, there's a fellow named John Climacus back in, I think, the 5th century. He was a monk, and he came up with, I think he was the one that came up with this idea of if you look in a mirror and you don't like what you see, do you throw away the mirror? Because if you get a new mirror, you're still going to see the same thing. And what a lot of us do, because we're not free enough to work on ourselves, or afraid, we keep throwing away the mirror. We keep trying to change the circumstances around us, the outsides of us, like the mirror, instead of saying, it's not the mirror that's the issue, it's me. And so we begin to need to work on ourselves. I think this is in Synovium. I think that example is also in the book Synovium. So we try to keep these things in mind as to what needs to be changed. Now, staying with some of that, the one of the things we do in the monastic life, and I think this can help all of us, is we really have a lot of freedom. And you would think we don't have freedom because we live by a rule, and a bell rings and we have to stop what we're doing and go do something else. The bell usually rings to say time to eat or time to pray in community, sing the holy office, if you will. But really, that bell is a sign of freedom. Because think how many times you say to yourself, I have no time to pray because I'm doing this. Or I have to do this and therefore I can't do that. We really are weighed down by that kind of life. And I think what we need is a prayer life that allows us to put down the very important things that we're doing and go and be at prayer, be more formal prayer. I'm not saying you're not praying when you're working, but to be at a deeper prayer. And that's exactly what we do. I don't wear a watch here. I don't need a watch. We have enough clocks. When the bell rings, I know where I'm supposed to stop doing what I'm doing and go do something else. And the bell always rings a couple of minutes before you're actually supposed to be there, so that you can go leisurely and sort of prep yourself for the singing in choir, as we call it, going to the chapel and singing psalms, listening to readings, and so on and so forth. We ring the bell when it's time for Mass, and so on and so forth. And for Catholics, often they say, I'm going to go to Mass. They put down what they're doing. But the rest of the day, there's often this thing, I have no time for. I have no time for. And that's really a lack of freedom. And I think the more you enter into the contemplative life, the more you enter into more meditative, reflective prayer, the more you're putting down the mirror and working on yourself. And you'll find yourself saying, or allowing yourself to say, this is not that important. That is not that important. It's not that it has no importance. It's not that important that I need to keep doing it and not open myself to prayer. So the very life of the monastic way, or the Benedictine rule for that matter, is saying, be free enough. And so we work. Work is one of the things we're supposed to be doing, but not work enslaved to it. So in a way, you might think that the monastic life is somewhat of a spiritual warfare, if you will, to try and get us to not make any one thing so important that we're not open to the surprising presence of God in our life. Uh, Another thing that I think we need to be free for, and I think that the contemplative life does, is be free from this need to control the prayer. How many people will say to me, "Oh, Terry," or "Oh, Father," or whatever they call me? They'll say, "I had a great prayer this morning, and I tried it at night. I did the same things, and my prayer was a mess." Well, you know, it's like changing the mirror. It is what it is. You're not trying to recreate a past experience. You had it. It's a grace. It's fine, but it's not about you in terms of you feeling good in the prayer. You have to be free of feeling good. You have to be free of your wants and open to your needs. And the need is to be transformed in relationship to God. And God is free to manifest God's self in whatever way God chooses at any moment of the day. And so we need to be free of trying to repeat yesterday's mood or yesterday's prayer experience. You don't want to be chained to a mood. You don't want to be imprisoned by a mood. I mean, you read something in a book and you say, "Oh, that's so wonderful! I can't wait. I'm going to get. I'll have that, and then I'll be fine. I won't be miserable anymore. I'll be happy." Oh, well, it comes and goes. Uh, it's all part of the transformative process because ultimately, what we're trying to do is let go of self or the bondage to false self, as you might call it, the bondage to moods and feelings and attitudes and goals, and open to God's working on us by allowing ourselves to be a little bit more agenda less. So I show up at we have vigils each morning. It starts at 4:30. And the more formal part, sitting in choir, listening to psalms and readings and such, that ends at around 5 a.m. And then I sit and for a certain length of time. And I find myself getting chained to this because yesterday morning was just perfect. In other words, I got what I wanted. I felt good, and so on and so forth. I'm looking forward to that, and my mind's all over the place. I'm thinking about cooking Thanksgiving dinner, or how I'm going to do this, or how I'm going to do that, or I'm thinking about something else that just trivial, you think, but it's taking up my whole time. So, what happened to me? Well, I got to let go. You not only let go of those thoughts, you let go of trying to repeat yesterday's mood. Uh, so, another thing I think we need in terms of our freedom is freedom to let go of stuff. Here's an example. Prayer takes time. Prayer costs something. And are you willing to pay the price? And if you're controlled by time, then no, not really. And that's why I like the bell ringing in the monastery. I'm not controlled by my time. I'm controlled by another time, the rules time, which means I got to learn to let go of whatever my time is doing, my precious time. And that often is what develops from a contemplative life, is a ministry in which your time becomes more available for something else besides your agenda, your plans for the day, or your plans for happiness, as Thomas Keating might call it. So we have to surrender not only time to be in a more contemplative prayer, a more meditative prayer. We have to let go of other activities that we were doing, and sometimes persons and places. I mean, I've had to let go of a lot of that to be up here in the monastery. I'm not with the people I was with like I was before. I'm not doing the things I was doing like I was doing before. And so on and so. Prayer costs. It just depends on to what payment are you willing to make. So overall, it's am I free to let go of my self-will and to be open to maybe the will of someone else, which in the contemplative practice is God, since there's nobody else there, if you will, getting in the way, so to speak. So we try to keep all this in mind. And I think what it's going to do is it's going to free us from the more contemplative life. I found it frees me little by little from the dualistic way of seeing the world. In an economic sense, in a sociological, cultural sense, duality prevails in our whole world. You can look at, well, our system of economy, which is by and large still capitalism. And when capitalism developed, or let's say really began to develop in the 19th century, another thing developed with it: unions. Unions developed because capitalism didn't care about the person. It cared about wealth and getting the lots of it for yourself. And so people became other. In other words, there wasn't a compassion for the worker by the owner or the manager. And that, so right there is a great reason for the contemplative life, is so that something like capitalism can be more concerned about the individual. On the other hand, you could go take communism or socialistic communism, which they might say they're concerned about the person, that we're all the same. But it wasn't non-duality. There was no spiritual element in that. It was atheistic communism that developed the no God thing. And when you throw God out, you sure throw out non-duality. And the individual doesn't matter at all. If you're a collective, the individual has no worth and no value. In the spiritual life, the individual has value. Non-duality says we all are one. That is, each of us has value, and our value is connected one to the other. But you can't be connected to the other if you're both valueless and, just a worker, if you will. So I try to remember that we are not tools for industrial development. We're not just part of making something, the product. There's labor, and then there's the tools of labor, there's the machinery, and then there's the raw materials such as coal or lumber. And we just become all part of that. In the monastic life, for instance, and I say it's a good model for all of us, each person has value, but in a non-dualistic sense. We're special as a community, but we don't want to make that go to our heads in an egocentric sense. And I think that's how you build on community. You see in the other, obviously you'll see their faults and their shortcomings and their idiosyncrasies and their idiocies or whatever. I'm sure they see it in me. But what overcomes that is because of the meditative prayer and God working on us, letting go of our agenda, if you will, we begin to see something in the other that attracts us and draws us, something of the God presence, something of grace, whatever you might call it. And we begin to see connectivity, even though there's differences. So we need to see differences so we're not just a conglomerate of collective socialism. We're not that in a monastery. And we're certainly not capitalists because we stop doing our work at a certain time. So we're not trying to maximize profits. And we don't charge the maximum. It's not supply and demand here. We always charge lower than our hay, for instance. we charge lower for our product than would be the market. That's right in the rule. So we are not, each individual one of us, and you're not an article of commerce and industry. You're not a thing. You are, and when you can sit in a more meditative prayer, you begin to free yourself from what the culture is trying to do, which is really make you just part of, well, it tries to make you not free. It says you're an individual, but then it wants you to buy like everybody else is buying. And I think we're coming into that. We have Black Friday, as it's called. It means that all the retail shops go into profit, which is they go into the black, as it's called in accounting circles, starting with Black Friday, because so many people are out shopping for Christmas, and you feel, sometimes you've probably felt in the past, I better shop now or there's not going to be anything there. And the question is why you're shopping at all. Well, that's a hard question to ask, much less to ponder. And you find such an energy pulling you. And yet it's supposed to be Advent, which is why we're giving a couple of talks on Wednesdays in the afternoon during Advent. It's supposed to be about something else, but it's been overcome. So it's called holidays. Nobody's going to call it Christmas. Nobody's going to call it Advent. And it's very commercial, blah, blah, blah. We've heard all that, so I'm not going to go into that a lot. But in terms of freedom, I think you do need a deeper prayer life to free yourself from being sort of sucked in to a way. Now, you may love to shop. That's fine. It's when you don't, when you feel yourself being drawn into it, you have to ask yourself, why is that? So Advent is a great time for personal change with resisting the consumer mentality that is so much part of our culture. So we are not just laborers in a system of producing products, and we're not just consumers in a system of buying products. And so if I were to look at my religion, my particular tradition of religion, and religion means connect. We're supposed to be connecting with God. That Christianity really started out as a religion of the poor. And some people have kind of tried to connect our consumer culture, our way of making more and more money or whatever. And they say, I'm a good Catholic, and yet they might be a defender of a system in which the individual is of no merit, underpaid, no medical insurance, and blah, blah, blah. We won't go too much into that. But you just have to remember how much the culture can imprison you, especially the time of year, which is called the holidays, by those who want to imprison you. Now, it is the another way of looking at this this freedom that I think the contemplative life can give us. For instance, I don't feel a big need here to be a shopper, which is good because there really aren't any stores around. So in some ways, I'm a little bit freed up. And we will have decorations. We're going to have a Christmas tree and so on and so forth. But I think what we need to keep in mind is some of the ways in which non-duality in our culture pervades, a non-duality that imprisons us. Those who have a lot, more than they need, you could say the 1%, but not just those. They tend to look down on people. Historically, the aristocratic class always had a contempt for labor because they didn't work. They owned land, and the peasants worked on the land. There's also a lot of racial pride. We have that today. So there's another way that we have non-duality. Um, and there's also a lot of preoccupation with the past. I'm going to go into this a little bit, especially in terms of my religion. If we want to change and be all God made us to be, and we want to be free to do that, I think we have to let go. We don't have to let go of the memories of the past, but we have to let go of living the past. You know, you can live the past with regrets, or you can live the past hoping to recover it in the present. That's not going to happen. Things tend to evolve in our culture, and it may be a good thing. But I find a lot of people in my religious tradition want to recover the past. Even though they weren't alive in the past they want to recover. They want to recover a medieval church. Or some want to recover a church of the 1950s, which they never lived in. I did. It was a fine church. It was the 1950s. It's not the 1950s anymore. Things move on, and they don't like what is, and they want to bring back the past. And there's a place where I see no freedom to see God working in the present moment, as if to say, oh, God stopped working in 1965 because everything fell apart after that. So God's not really doing what God's supposed to do. God can only work in the medieval church or the church of the 1950s or the early 20th century or whatever. But if you want to change, that means you evolve. You don't change to get back to something, you evolve. So my church needs to evolve. The religious culture needs to evolve instead of trying to recover the past. So I think this is something to keep in mind. So things are different now. I find, for instance, I'm much more open to a multicultural world. And I wasn't always open to a multicultural world. I wanted a world that looked just like me. I grew up in the Bronx. All the kids around me were white. There were no Jews in our neighborhood. Matter of fact, when I was before the third grade, there were no Italians. It was German and Irish. And then I moved to a suburb, and all white kids around, all English-speaking kids. Families, all same kind of economic, sociological backgrounds. And, it was a nice world. Well, that world doesn't exist anymore. But people are still trying to fight to get back to whatever they think our founding fathers wanted. Basically, they want to get back to something that is more like them, looks like them, and sounds like them. And that's just not it. So our country's evolving as much as my religious tradition is evolving. And and there's just a lot of people who are fleeing, suffering, and wanting to get in here. And they say, oh, no, we don't want that. Well, once you look at Jesus, he had a problem with prejudice. Not his problem, everybody else's problem. What was their problem with him? First of all, he didn't have an education. He wasn't a rabbi. People called him rabbi, but he didn't have formal studies that we know of. And he came from Podunk. He didn't come from a big city. He came from Nazareth. Yeah, he went to Jerusalem sometimes, but he was a carpenter. He's a blue-collar worker. So blue-collar worker, small-town guy, as far as anybody knew, didn't do anything of any merit till he was about 30. And then he goes around shooting his mouth off about the kingdom of God is in your midst and healing people. What's all this about? So a lot of people didn't like him, and they couldn't shut him up, so they killed him. So he had a problem with prejudice. So I think that the contemplative life can free us. I think it's freeing me from prejudice, from wanting everything to be like me, to being open to a multi-world. In other words, I'm supposed to be part of a universal church. And it all sounds good until you live it in my neighborhood, right? Well, I think the contemplative life opens us because it opens us to non-duality. It gets us, as we get inside of ourselves, it breaks down the barriers around ourselves, if you will. And I think this is important. Now, another thing is that I think we need to be free of, and the contemplative life does this, is I'll just call it the attitude of revolution. We need a revolutionary change. Who's ever in charge, get rid of them and put somebody else in charge, which of course would be me, right? Well, why don't you just look at the history of revolution? What happens? Okay, so here's how it starts out. This is just an example. The rich, they're tormenting the poor, okay? The poor rise up. They kill the rich and they reform everything, but they reform it into the economic interests of what were the poor. And they start killing anybody who doesn't agree with them. The Russian Revolution would be a great example of that. So the idea that economic revolution, I'm not saying you don't need economic change, but the idea of economic revolution that kills people is the only solution to something is not really so. Danny Ortega is running one of those Central American countries. Well, he used to be a revolutionary. I remember, and during the Reagan administration, he said, this guy's a bad guy, huh? Well, eventually he got power. And what does he do? He gets rid of people who don't agree with him. So the contemplative life is so important because, all of our ways of fixing up the world without a deep prayer life just doesn't work because it's all so self-centered. Whatever we think is the solution, if it doesn't have a spiritual center, it's just throwing away one mirror and picking up another. And I look at that in terms of stuff that's going on in our country and politics and so on and so forth. So we got to keep this in mind. And we cannot base we're so chained to judging people by the property they have, the money they have, the language they speak, the culture they have, rather than on their personal worth as valued as part of God's creation. And I think this is what you see. This is what you see in the monastic life is we're all anonymous. The monastic life is not a democracy. The abbot's in charge, everybody else, we're nothing, so to speak. I mean, we have no particular authority. And but the rule gives us an authority. But on paper, the abbot's in charge and everybody else is a monk. And even if you're an ordained priest and say Mass in your confessions, you're still a monk. You're not better than. And I look at this in terms of again, our religious culture. We have a big problem finding new vocations to the monastic life. Why don't young people want to be monks? Now, to speak about men in this instance, I know a little bit about this. Because in our culture, not the monastic culture, our secular culture, people are not valued anymore. They're not considered important. And you can see this trying to fix things up with economics and politics. People are just not valued. So a young man, for instance, sees that, you say, hey, how about getting this degree in college? It's going to cost you a loan of $200,000, but you're going to get the degree. Then you can't find a job, or you find a job, it doesn't pay very much, and there's no guarantees, and you're not going to get medical, and you got a $200,000 college loan. Well, you don't feel very important, do you? Or you can't find any job at all. So why would you want, or you do find a job and you're not considered that significant in the job. You're just another cog in the wheel. And why would any young man look at a monastery where you're an anonymous person? You're not important. You are, but no. When he starts out, what do they give him to do? Clean floors and toilets. He'll do that for months at a time, maybe a couple of years. Breaking down the ego. Well, he comes in, he doesn't have much of an ego. and you're just not a significant person, it seems, in this life. I look at it and I say, hey, I used to be somebody. I was a pastor. I was important. People needed me. And they got lots of compliments. And I said, here I am here. Nobody needs me. If I were to die tomorrow, what's going to change? So, yeah, I look at that and I says, whatever made me do this? It had to be the grace of God, because it sounds like craziness otherwise to do this, make this move. So why would a young man want to do this? So he's really not free to be nothing, because the culture made him nothing. And so he doesn't want to pursue a life of prayer in which you let go of your wants, your egocentricities, your self-will. But we don't have a problem in vocations to the priesthood. We get a lot of vocations to the priesthood. Why is that? Because the seminaries nowadays are telling young men, you're important, you're significant, you're better than those lay people. And we're going to put you in charge of a parish in which you can tell people what to do. And you're not going to have to get a loan. Wow, that sounds pretty darn good. And you're going to get medical and so on and so forth. All you have to do is not get married. Well, a lot of people postponing marriage anyway. That looks good to a lot of guys. So I find that the contemplative life is a big challenge. If you want to be important in our culture, you're not going to be important in the contemplative life in some ways, because you're letting go of you're letting go of your desires, your self-will, bondage to self. You're letting go of fears. You're letting go of a lot of things. And you're allowing yourself to sit there sometimes feeling like you're an idiot. Nothing's going on. I'm bored to death. And somebody's going to tell you this is important. It's a hard thing to do. So you've got to be free enough to accept that and not look for the immediate payoff. So we got to keep that in mind. Now, so in some ways you're all the same, but there can be qualitative distinctions in our spiritual development. In other words, somebody here in this monastery and somebody in your own life can be very much like you in a non-dual sense, but you know that they are more spiritually advanced than you are. Or maybe you're more spiritually advanced than they are. That's a qualitative distinction. It's not a separation. And it comes from, an example would be spiritual development. As we develop spiritually, we do change. And we change relative to someone else who's not changing much at all. So what I have to keep in mind is that I'm not better than, I'm the same as, with some qualitative distinctions. And one of the things I find, and I think this is one of the reasons that where we come out of our contemplative practice, the half hour that we sit, we come out of that with an energy to be of service to others. Because sometimes what happens in the prayer is you really have a great experience, and the tendency is to say, wow, I'm really moving along. And then there's ever so subtle energy that says, and that guy near me, he's not moving along at all. What an idiot. I'm better than he is. You don't say it out loud. You would reject it if you thought about it, but it's still there. Service is what comes out of the contemplative prayer life. Service. You're of service to others. And what does service do? It has a leveling dimension, if you will. When you're service to others, it's a leveling dimension. And this is one of the things that COVID interferes with this. We're not as available for service because we're trying to avoid people rather than be with people. So it's interfering with this one-to-one. But I'll give you an example. So here I am doing this teaching this morning, and then it will go into a video because it's being recorded, and another whole bunch of people will listen to it, and so on and so forth. And I could very easily say, "Oh boy, Terry, you're just a spiritual guru." But you know what? After I do this, I got to go to the kitchen. I'm going to the kitchen and make food for people. It's work. And then, so service is, I'm not making food for them, I'm better than them. It's just being of service. And that's a great leveling effect, which is why I think we need to find some way to be personally of service to others so that we can not get too caught up in how much better I am than they are. Because maybe you have a qualitative distinction, but you don't want to let in your spiritual development, but you want to make sure that it's of service. And of course, we see that in so many people who we admire their lives, because the depth of their spirituality, then they go about, what do we call it? Chopped wood and haul water. That's what the Buddhists call it, chopped wood, haul water. It's love seeking nothing for itself, is what some person said. Love seeking nothing for itself. So if I can be loving, not because you'll praise me or because I'm special, better than, but I seek nothing for myself. Now that's real service. And it's one of the things I think will come out of this attitude that we'll get from our contemplative development is service to others without seeking something for myself, if you will. I think it was Nikolai Berdayev who said this. I'm sure he's not the only one who said it. Maybe he quoted somebody else. He says, "Love a poor person, not the poor." So, for instance, I can write a check to Humanitas or Feed the Hungry or Catholic Charities or whatever, and to take care of the poor, write a check to somebody taking care of people in Haiti. But I'm not taking care of anybody in Haiti. So what we're challenged to do, and COVID has gotten in the way, but hopefully we'll get through this, is to love a poor person. Let's take it out of the economic and just put it into the any day thing. Love the person, not just the group that's out there. So that's a lot harder thing to do, is to love the particular person, because to love the poor and write a check, you don't have to put up with the smell. Or maybe they're not in a good mood. Lives are miserable. They're not in a good mood. I often have told a story of the person who went to work in Catholic Charities because they they loved the poor, but they didn't love a poor person. And when they met a poor person cursed them out and threw the soup in their face, saying the soup tastes lousy. The person never came back to work in the soup kitchen. They didn't want to love a person who was poor. They wanted to love the poor people out there someplace. So that's what you got to do. So what you learn in this life, without a prayer life, the monastery couldn't exist. It just couldn't. You have to have a deeper prayer life. And St. Bernard, no, as Benedict. I wrote this down. Benedictine rule says, learn to love and accept the people you live with. So let's move away from this. Oh, I don't have any poor people around me. Well, love and respect and accept. That's three things. Accept them as they are, respect them as God's creation, and love them for themselves with all their imperfections. That's what's going to change you. When a lot of people, they want to throw away the mirror. They say, I don't like these people around me. And they do it geographic. They leave, they move. I don't like my job, I quit. I'm not saying you shouldn't quit your job, but there's some people that use that to avoid changing themselves. And I've heard any number of people talk about how their job was terrible, and they later learned out that the problem was themselves, and the job wasn't the problem. They needed to change, and that people around them would change, and their boss would change, and so on and so forth. So a lot of times it's best to start working on yourself before you decide that the outside world is the problem. Now, another thing I think we can look at, and I have found this in my own life, although other people it's been indicated, is art. Not the name art as an author, but art as in a museum, let's say. Well, art is very creative, but it's often done by an individual who has to believe in himself or herself, and often undergoes some difficulties in producing their art. God is an artist, and God is painting the picture called non-duality. It's creation. Creation is non-duality. And when I'm inside myself, all about my problems and my miseries, I don't even look at the stars at night. This morning, I must have been out of sight of myself because I woke up and I looked out my window and the stars were shining, which means it's going to be a beautiful day, which it is. I just looked out the window here in the mountains of Colorado. And then I looked out the stars from other places in the building and said, oh, just so gorgeous. And little old me is part of that. And I'm significant in God's eyes, but don't let it go to your head, Terry. So art is creative. God is showing us in God's creativity. And when I look at it, there's kind of a transformation in me. I get outside of myself and into myself in the best ways. Because the artist sees something in the world and tries to express what they see. They're not taking it. They're trying with a photograph. They see something in a scene, and they're trying to bring that scene out. It could be a photograph, could be a painting, could be a sculpture, could be a piece of music. There's something about the world, and they see it. You call it transfiguration. In other words, there's what everybody sees, and then something, wow. There's a scene in the scripture with Jesus where he's transfigured on the mountaintop. He goes up and there's a guy from Nazareth, the teacher, the healer, and boom, he's just surrounded and through full of light. Where'd that come from? Well, it's always there, but something needs to bring it out. So the artist is trying to liberate us from seeing the world around us as ugly. And I think that contemplative prayer is artistic. It doesn't so much create from nothing. God's did that. It sees, experiences, and tries to share through your own life as a contemplative with others the beauty that you see. Sometimes you see a beauty in another person through your contemplative life. You are trying to help them to see the beauty in themselves by the way you act and treat them, and maybe sometimes encourage them. So I think of the 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century Impressionists. So they see a tree, but they don't just see a tree. They see all kinds of color, and they paint something that's tree-ish, but it's got all these beautiful colors. And I may walk through the same park, and I look at a tree, and I see a tree. But the artist sees so much more. Or they might keep coming back different times of the day. There was one impressionist that painted the same thing over and over, but he would paint it at different times of the day and see different light that I couldn't see. Well, that artist has a deep spiritual life. And you say, well, they go to church? You're back to institutional religion. I don't know, and I don't think it's important to what that artist is doing. But what the artist is doing, so you have the Impressionists in the 19th century in the United States. You had these Western landscapes, these huge landscapes that were painted. I think a guy named Remington was one of them. And any case, and there'd be a person in it, a little tiny person in this big scene to remind us of how magnificent this world is, and we're just a little part of it. So don't tear it apart. It's bigger than you are. So I think when going to a museum, for instance, and I like going to art museums, and I look at the paintings, it's liberating myself from any way that I might see the world as ugly. It liberates me from the slavery to everyday life. Sometimes we get enslaved to everyday life. First of all, you've got to give yourself permission to go to the museum. I got no time to go to no museum. So you are locked in. You are a prisoner of yours or somebody else's agenda. And I think art is to liberate us from that kind of slavery. And contemplative prayer is artistic prayer. Because as I said, it costs. It costs time. It costs putting aside something else that you thought was important in order to do this. So museums can really be spiritual exercises. So can a meditative walk in a forest or a garden. Churches were built, in my tradition, with all kinds of artwork, and they were open all day long. It was art that was free to the poor. It was teaching about God and Christ and the Trinity through to people who couldn't read, through art, statues, stained glass windows, and so on. It's very designed to the place, and it was free to the poor. So God is, someone has said this, God is a spirit of freedom. The Holy Spirit, if you will, is a spirit of freedom, trying to free us up to prioritize our lives so that we can be all that God meant us to be and not be chained to somebody else's agenda. And so it's a liberation, but it's always in conflict with the prevailing culture, which wants to imprison you and do this, do that. I think the whole holiday season is for many people an imprisonment. I know people that the day after Christmas, they tear down their tree and throw it out in the road. They just had it. They're tired of all this stuff, but why did they do it in the first place? Well, I think you have to ask them. What we want is a spiritual liberation, always be available to turn to God and away from the messaging of the media and culture and so on and so forth. We're looking for an attainment of wholeness. And in a sense, we're whole, but we don't know it. In another sense, we're not whole. We're broken. And holiday shopping isn't going to put us back together again. So if we don't work on the contemplative life, we're going to become idolatrous. We're going to worship the things that the cultural advertising tells us to worship. And you don't want to get caught up in that. I think that, for instance, I'll use this example in my own church. I used to hear, "We are the one true church. Everybody else is false." That's an idolatry, I think. I don't worship the church. I worship God. I don't worship the institutional church, but rather the church as it expresses sacramentally the life of God working in my life. That's good. And another thing, and we're getting towards the hour, is don't get so imprisoned by health issues. In other words, a preoccupation with exercise and diet. I think moderation is not a bad idea, but to where you put so much time into avoiding death is really what I think a lot of it is. And up here, one of the things about the monastery is your bags are packed, you're ready to go. And maybe not a young man, but you just realize that ultimately we're meant for God. That is both here and in the beyond. And there is a beyond. So what are you so afraid of? But a lot of it is fear of death, and that's just another imprisonment. So I make sure and ask myself, okay, I got to exercise. Oh, and what is it that you're giving up so you can exercise? I can't tell you the number of times in my life that I skipped prayer, but I got physically healthy. I don't want to be enslaved to it. I want to do things in moderation. So as we are moving towards the end, a couple of things. Contemplative life is living in the now moment. And the cultural media doesn't want us in the now. It wants us to get up, get out, and do something, basically buy something. And we have to remember that if you stay in the now, there'll probably be enough urges in your day to pray. You say, I don't have any urge to pray. Try to stay in the now moment. But it works both the chicken and the egg. If you are practicing a more meditative life, you'll get more into the now. And as you're in the now moment, you will experience moments that invite you to stop what you're doing and just be present at that moment. And if that happens, wow, what you're going to find is a present in which there is a fullness that you didn't know. It'll be like somebody said, a perfection in an emergence from time. What a way to end. You're emerging from tick-tock time into a more perfect world of the moment. And that's where God lives, not in tick-tock time, in the present moment. So keep in mind our transformation, the more you are into non-duality, the more you will be transformed. So I think we come to the end of our hour. We could take a short break. It's 10:02. We'll take a 5-minute break. Let's come back at 10:07. Gives you a chance to see if there's any questions that you would like to ask. Okay? 10:07. Oh, and if you'd like to support me, we'll throw that up. You can do it through Venmo, or you can do it through just send a check here. Because I have to pay my bills. I have a lot of bills I got to pay. All right, so we're going to take a 5-minute break. 10:07 on your computer, or 10:07 Mountain Time. Where have I been? In the kitchen. In the kitchen, getting ready for lunch for these worthless monks. Oops, excuse me. That's the false self. Well, here we are back. Welcome. And look at all these chats. Support through a chat. Please use the chat for any questions or unmute yourself if you have any questions. So let's see if there's anybody who has anything that they want to ask me. It's okay if you don't. I am, let's see. I have no plans to go anywhere till the spring, and I still don't have plans to do anything then. So I'm going to do my second winter here, and I'm trying to just how would I put it? To continue to practice the routines. I'll give you one more thing. Here, we do something called Lectio Divina. Now, it's you can read about what it is. It's a certain way of reading the scripture. But what we do is, this is another freedom that you might give yourself, and I think it will come out of a deeper prayer life, is you don't read what someone else tells you to read in the Bible. You pick a book, let's say a Gospel of Mark, for an example. You pick a book, the Gospel of Mark, and you read it slowly, chapter by chapter, and you ponder it in small sections. You are free to read it as slowly as you want. It's suggested that you never just quickly read it, move on to the next. It's suggested that you read a small passage. If a sentence grabs you, you just sit with it, let it work on you, because the scripture is alive. Now, why is that free? Because a lot of people feel that they have to read a certain scripture for the day in my tradition, the gospel for today, and they're supposed to focus on that. But Lectio says you pick your own book and you read it at your own pace, but slowly. You're not trying to get information. You're not trying to just be able to repeat a story. Remember, it's all about you being transformed and to be who you want to be. So I find, and you do it, there's a certain amount of time put aside for it. But on the other hand, you could do more of it as you have some of your own free time. So it's a particular way of reading scripture. And what it does, I think, is it's another way of helping us to get into what is often called eternal time, or kairos, if you will. It's God, which is eternal time, erupting into your tick-tock time, in which you're trying to forget about clocks and calendars. I'm just going to put aside some time for reading. I'm not thinking about what I'm going to do next, whenever that next is. And to have some of that kind of time each day is just so precious. And it's a great freedom to give yourself, a freedom to say, go be. See, when I'm sitting in a contemplative practice, I may say, I'm going to sit for 40 minutes and a little clock will go off. But I try to find some time to just sit with Lectio. And I says, yeah, there's some general things out there that have to do, but I mean, it's not the same as I got to cook a meal. There's just some general things. I need to clean my room, okay? Something like that. But I'll get to it when I get to it. But right now, I'm just going to sit with this scripture. You free yourself from being chained to, this is the next task I'm going to do. And that's what I like about trying to make Lectio something that's at least for a while, time free. And to give yourself that kind of a day in which you can have free time, and just look at the scripture. You don't feel compelled. There's nobody's going to give you an exam on how long did it take you to read the Gospel of Mark. And maybe take you a year, maybe take you 3 months. I don't know. Who cares? It's for your benefit, and God's working on you. So what we're trying to do is free ourselves from what is called the victory of historical time, moment by moment. Free yourself from that being victorious over your life. You have today as a free gift from God. You didn't earn it. You don't deserve it. You could have died in your sleep. You could get hit by a car, whatever. And what you're looking for is a life in which, at least in some part, you are victorious over time in history, in calendar time, if you will. I think that's the resurrection. The resurrection is really victory over historical time. When was Jesus raised? He was seen as risen. It wasn't as if anybody says, oh, it was at this particular moment. He was seen as, they say, in 3 days I'll be raised up. That's when they saw him, 3 days. So they say 3 days. They don't know when of the day, but it could be a figure of speech for all I know. But he's raised. He's alive. He's not dead. And resurrection beats historical time. And we're supposed to be resurrection people. So let yourself become more creative, more of an artist in prayer. And so until we meet again, I'm going to be doing the Advent series. It'll begin the first Wednesday after Thanksgiving, the first Wednesday after Thanksgiving. So it's early December, I think. I have to look myself. I think we put it up. We'll be putting out some information on that here and there, but it's a Wednesday afternoon. There it is. December 1, a Wednesday afternoon, 2 o'clock my time, 4 o'clock East Coast time. Out here in the mountains, it's tea break time. I'm going to talk about Advent and try and get us off of the historical pounding of the culture that pressures us. Pressure for happy holidays. Christmas should not be a pressure. Remember, Jesus came into our life uninvited. We didn't prepare for it. So now we get to kind of do a little preparation. So 2 o'clock, Wednesday, December 1 will be our first Advent talk, and the second one, same time, Wednesday, December 8th. So thank you all for coming. This is going to be recorded, and it should be on YouTube. Just look at snowmass.com, and it'll show you where to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, Father.